I'm Ann Davis O'Neill, chatting with director Pj Perez about his feature-length documentary, Parkway of Broken Dreams. It screens November 6th as part of Valley Film Festival 21. And first of all, I want to thank you, PJ, for being here. I want to let you know how much I enjoyed your film and congratulations on being part of the Valley Film Festival this year.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
would you like to share a little bit about what the movie's about?
Yeah. So Parkway of Broken Dreams tells the somewhat unknown story of a very vibrant but short lived cultural scene that developed around the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in the 1990s. Specifically, sort of at the same time that alternative culture was booming nationally, that coffee shop culture was really becoming a thing. We saw that popularized in media like Friends and things like that. Just the idea of people hanging out together, sitting on couches, drinking coffee, and making connections with people. That happened in Las Vegas all along one street, basically. And even though it was connected to a university area, it attracted a very diverse group of poets and musicians and artists from all over town. And it somewhat died out despite being next to, a very large state university. So the film sort of explores what fostered that scene in the first place, and then what sort of led to its demise in the late 90s, early 2000s.
You wore more than one hat on this production. So could you share a little bit about the process of putting it together?
Yeah, I mean, I wore pretty much all of the hats. I mean, some of that was budgetary. A lot of it was budgetary. My background is as a journalist, initially, primarily, and then I started pivoting to first video journalism, and then doing like short films, and then I started getting into like narrative filmmaking. But I've always done documentary stuff on a short scale. So the initial impetus for the film story actually came from an oral history that I wrote about the era back in 2006. It was published in a magazine called Las Vegas Weekly. And, it was like a 6,000 word story that I had spoken to about a dozen people for. And it got really great reception. This was still kind of pre social media being super popular, so people were still actually like writing letters into the publication. I mean, they were emails, but they were still, and they just got letters for weeks. And it made me realize I had tapped something, and that there was this sort of shared connection between all of not just the people who experienced that, but like people who lived in Las Vegas who understood the things that came from that. And I mean, this is getting a little bit off topic, but it sets it up a bit. So I had kind of kept coming back to this idea over the years. Like I had started actually shooting footage for a documentary about that scene back in 2007, literally just like on the whatever digital camera I had at the time, which this was 2007, so it was not HD even, it was not high quality. I actually posted some of it on the website for the film just so people could see, this grainy footage that I was shooting then. But I kept coming back to it. And like every couple of years, somebody would like post some footage that was shot on like a camcorder back in the day. And you'd be like, man, somebody should do something with this and actually like make a formal documentary. And I just kept coming back to it. So finally, fast forward to 2018, I'm not living in Las Vegas. I live in Southern California. I, at that point, had been doing filmmaking for a few years, and I had the tools and the skills somewhat to do this, and I had some time. I didn't really go into it with a lot of planning. I had a Google document that was like Untitled Maryland Parkway documentary, and it would pretty much said, what if we took the oral history and just filmed it? That was literally it. I was like, and that's what I did. I printed out the article and I went to the first person who I interviewed for the previous story and brought a camera, a couple of LED lights, a lavalier mic. And I was just like, okay, here's the stuff that you talked about before, talk about it again. And that was basically how it started. And it kind of just went from there. I did a lot of learning along the way. Let's put it that way.
The coffee house culture happened in several cities in the US. What was unique about the Las Vegas version of it?
I think what was unique about it happening in Las Vegas is that it was Las Vegas at all. Not a lot of people outside of Las Vegas, and honestly, a large amount who do live there don't associate Las Vegas with anything capital C culture, right? It's less so these days. Like I think that it's more well known for being a more diverse type of culture and not just kind of what you find on the strip or in nightclubs or whatever. But especially back in the 1990s, this was when Vegas was undergoing a boom, right? It was a huge population boom, but all that really meant was you had, the suburbs growing astronomically. The population literally doubled between 1990 and 2000 from 500,000 to 1 million plus. So it was experiencing a lot of growth in that way, but it wasn't experiencing growth in, I think, the standing nationally, internationally as a place where, it had the same amenities that you would find in other cities, right? So everyone knew about what was happening in Seattle in the 90s, right? LA had its rock scene moment in the 80s, and before that, I mean, ever since the birth of rock and roll. New York had the punk scene in the 70s, and then in the early 2000s, you had the kind of resurgence of the sort of post-punk bands led by like the Strokes and stuff like that. Chicago had its scene documented, and people know about Portland, but this stuff was happening in Vegas around the same time as all these other things, but it just didn't get any attention. It was very, very strong, but very, very small, right? Because there was no infrastructure and there was no official support from the city or the county or any sort of financial backers, really. So it was really just a scrappy group of people loosely putting on poetry readings and video shows and raves in the back of bars and doing just impromptu musical performances in coffee shops, but this is the scene that eventually led to much bigger things. People who started as DJs at the local radio station that were on that street, they went on to become like music industry powerhouses. The band The Killers played their first shows at these coffee houses. Anthony Zucker, who went on to create CSI, he hung out there in these coffee houses and wrote. It was just like a place where I think there was a lot of creative energy that provided a sort of primordial stew, as someone says in the film. But it was a cultural primordial stew where these things, it didn't get a lot of attention at the time, but these people went on to have an impact in the world.
At a certain point, there seemed to be a change at the radio station that affected the culture around it.
Yeah, I mean, KUNV was a nationally award-winning college radio station. It had won the Gavin Awards, which was like basically the top awards for college radio programming back in the 1990s several times. And it was so entrenched in the culture because that was how you found out about shows. That was how you found out about new music. Remember, this is not entirely pre-internet, but it was pre-internet as we know it today. This is, when AOL they weren't even sending out the CDs yet. I think they probably maybe had 3.5-inch floppy disks, which, a lot of people watching this probably won't know what the heck I'm talking about. And it was weird because it was a radio station, but it was also a physical part of that place because the radio station was right at the front building of the university, which was right across from all these coffee shops and record stores and music venues and bars. And you would go to the station and just hang out. It's just like the DJ, your friends would be the DJs, and you'd hang out on the station and you'd get to check out new music. And then, they'd have running a sort of contest or promo to be like, oh, hey, here's tickets to go see, Nine Inch Nails at this little theater. This is before they're playing arenas, right? Like, or, Pixies are playing here or whatever it is. And it really made that it provided not just a soundtrack, but also a connecting point for, people to go to record stores and buy music or to go to the venues and see the bands or, whatever the case was. So that diversity of programming that the station offered, because it was basically jazz during the day and then like alternative and hip hop and other stuff like that at night. Well, in 1998, a new general manager takes over. They get rid of the nightly Rock Avenue programming, which has all the more everything outside of jazz. Well, you lose your you lose your college audience then, and you lose that diversity of music that was feeding the record stores and the venues. And it literally had a direct impact on the business of, these places on that street. So yeah, it was really interesting how, and everybody who I talked to for the film brought it up. Everybody like talked about KUNV either influencing them in their, development as music fans or as musicians, or as feeding their businesses. Like everybody brought this up, and it was a really, really impactful thing that, honestly, it's a documentary of its own.
And what do you miss most about the period of time portrayed in the documentary?
My hair. It's funny because you would think that I'd get nostalgic for it, but we were all young, or most of us were young, and we were doing things that we thought were unique, but they weren't unique. It just happened to be that we were all doing them at the same time, and it was fresh for us. I miss the way that you could just show up with no plan and something cool would happen. That was the thing, because we didn't, again, this is pre-cell phones being everywhere, pre-internet. You could read a local publication and find out what was happening on a weekly or monthly basis, but day in and day out, it wasn't like you were texting your friends or getting on Facebook and seeing where people were going and RSVPing to events. Like, you would just show up at a coffee shop at 6 o'clock at night. That's when you would start drinking coffee, because that makes sense. And there would either be something happening there, or somebody would come and they would and tell you, hey, there's a show happening at the record store down the street. Let's go. And you would just go, and you would have no plan and no agenda. And it was really great that way, because you could just go and hang out and just do nothing for a couple hours and just smoke cigarettes and drink coffee and maybe write bad poetry, which is what I did. Or there could be something amazing happening that you never would have known about otherwise. So that was probably the thing that I miss, is more sort of that just showing up thing, less so than the specific institutions themselves. The film is a historical documentary about a music and art scene, but it's also a bit, and my background is as a journalist, but I also majored in sociology in college, and I did approach it from somewhat of a sociological perspective, because it is basically an ethnography of a group at a specific time in a specific place. But it also gets into sort of bigger picture issues of what happens to an organic cultural scene when there's not any sort of infrastructure to support it. Mm-hmm. Because something that came up throughout the film over and over was, this should have lasted forever. And it did eventually move to another part of Las Vegas, where it was fostered by investment from both private investors and from the city. So it is also, I think, a good lesson for other communities of what to do and what not to do in terms of trying to develop and foster these sort of cultural touch points, and making sure that they can survive, into other generations.
What's next for you and for the documentary?
After the Valley Film Festival, it's preparing for a March national public television broadcast. So we've been picked up by NITA, which distributes programming to public television, and we're currently slated for a late March offering to public television stations across the nation. So I'm working on doing a 60-minute edit of the film for that, for broadcast, and as well as trying to find underwriters for the broadcast. So that's kind of what's probably going to be taking up the next couple of months, as we also do additional screenings, and hopefully, get ready to do additional distribution in the near future.
Well, great. Well, it was a pleasure meeting you via Zoom, and be on the lookout. If you like punk music and you want to see a part of Vegas you have never seen if you've only visited the Strip, check out this movie.